Let's learn Bezat Hashem for the safe return of all the hostages, for complete healing for those who've been wounded, and for complete end to the killing, and peace, if such a thing is within the realm of possibility. Last time we went through the first three principles. God the Creator, God is one, and God is incorporeal, does not have a body or a physical presence of any kind. I just want to explore these a little bit because, as we've said, these are kind of headlines. They're actually a lot more complex than they may seem if we just read them. For example, those who read the Ani Mamins every day in the Siddur, or who recite the Yigdal poem. So the first principle is, we could call it like a portmanteau concept, right? It's one little package, but it's got several ideas together. I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, is the Creator and guide of all created things, that the Creator alone has made and does make and will make all things. So embedded in the statement is, first of all, although it's not stated explicitly, is the notion of God being eternal, based on the notion that everything that exists comes into existence through a cause. If God is not eternal, God cannot be the ultimate cause and source of all existence. God alone is the cause of the existence of all things, and even of the notion of existence itself. So Rambam worked this out in greater detail, as we read, Baruch Hashem, 2.5 years ago, at the beginning of Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. There is a first existent, and that all that exists draws its aspect of existence from the existence of this first existent, Matzui Rishon, he called it. God alone being eternal, the fact of existence itself arises from God's existence. God also being the guide of all created things means that God implants the meaning of existence in each object and every being. So, welcome. This seemingly simple statement comprises a complex and, I would say, not necessarily universally accepted theology. When I say not universally, I mean not necessarily universally accepted in Judaism. For humans, the meaning of existence is what we call, our purpose in life. I want to find my purpose in life. And in fact, the underlying purpose of life is the search for the purpose of life itself. In our understanding, this is very different from everything else in creation. A rock cannot choose to be a not rock, and a river cannot unbecome a river, and a bee cannot rebel from its nature of flying and stinging and making honey. Humans are characterized by freedom of choice. And there are those who say that Tselem Elohim, the image of God in the book of Genesis, the definition of that is our ability to choose. A fox has the freedom to choose whether to turn to the left or the right, or whether to flee or to hide. In our understanding, the animal's behavior is driven by instinct. Human freedom of choice is not only that we decide whether to turn left or right, or whether to move forward or stand still, but we are actually constantly plagued by the knowledge that the choice is ours to make. On an existential level, we are terrorized by the awareness that our own choices determine our fate. And even when, as Baruch Hashem is the case for most of us here most of the time, we don't feel that our lives are exposed and that our existence hangs in the balance, we still agonize over every decision in the awareness that by choosing action A, we forever shut the door on action B. The notion of God as a guide then also prompts us to follow the halakha, to study Torah, to pray, putting all our resources to work in an effort to bring God's guiding hand into our lives. At its best, Rambam will say that we base our actions on God's laws and strive to follow the halakha in action and in thought, while engaging in a constant intellectual pursuit of striving to know God. Rambam acknowledges, not here in the 13 Principles, but in many of his other writings, acknowledges that humans are ultimately not capable of fully knowing God. Perhaps no human being, and perhaps not ever, but the quest itself is the meaning of human existence. As Jews, as inheritors of the Torah, we have an additional, call it a leg up on the rest of humanity, because we have this great book, which is the User's Guide to Human Existence. It's a great gift, and it's also a tremendous burden, because having received it, willy-nilly, it's not like we woke up and said, I want that Torah, but we're the inheritors of it. We're now also obligated to follow it. So I would say this casts a light on the concept of belief, which was the first thing that we discussed when we embarked on learning the introduction to Chelek. Our relationship with God and our study of Torah and our application of Torah's principles cannot be static. As the saying goes, it's the journey that matters and not the destination. So this very first principle, which is stated in seemingly very simple terms, lays out to us the complexity of the full challenge of being human in general, and in particular of being a Jewish human being. I would go so far as to say that in Rambam's world, anybody who says, I trust in God and I'm leaving everything in God's hands, without pushing themselves to go further, both in terms of practice and in terms of study and understanding, has rejected the challenge of being human, and rejected in particular the specific challenge and the gift and the obligation placed on us by the Torah. Another point, God as the creator and guide also implies the nature of God's powers, which raises another complex theological issue. Rambam holds that God interacts with the world in accordance with the rules of nature. These are the rules which God created and imposed on creation at the moment of creation. In the guide, which Bezrat Hashem we will study, maybe before too long, the Rambam says that God not being able to do certain things does not conflict with the reality of God's absolute power. God cannot make a square whose sides are of the same length as the diagonal. God cannot commit suicide. God cannot take on a corporeal form. Cannot take on the form of a human body. Cannot manifest in the human form. Now there are some, for example, Rabbi Nachman says, why not? Rabbi Nachman says, why can't God make a square with the sides equal to the diagonal? The fact that we cannot imagine a thing is proof not of God's inabilities, but of our lack of our limitations, if you will. And the more serious objection, which is raised constantly to Rambam, is by defining God in any way, ascribing to God qualities or attributes, that is in itself limiting God, and God cannot be described as having limitations. Sir?
You just read that life goes according to nature.
I'm listening.
This is today newspaper in Italy. The Nile is
from volcanic ash?
No, from
Ireland, Iceland?
No, from
the Nile River is turned red.
Greenery. That,
from rotted vegetation.
yes.
Okay, it's that time. The River Nile is turned red.
Last time was in 2016.
And the last time before that was Moshe standing in front of Paro.
This is what
Thank
they
you.
are saying here.
So is this to say that Hashem is not supernatural?
The nature of Hashem is beyond nature. God created nature. But God interacts with the world through nature. I think I'm going to explain it. Okay, I would say that the objections miss the point of God not being quote unquote able to accomplish things. It's not a lack of power or capacity, as we would define it in human terms. It is a limitation that's inherent in our world, and a failure on our part to understand the notion of capability. We compare God's capabilities to our capabilities. God's impossibility of performing the impossible makes sense in Rambam's world, where the human intellect is the definition of Tzelem Elokim, the image of God. Even though most of us will never perfect ourselves intellectually, our experience of and our examination of the created world is the basis of our striving to attain perfect knowledge of God, and it is in and of itself sufficient. The fault lies not in ourselves, not in our stars, but in ourselves. Okay, the problem is not that God is not fully manifest in the world. The problem is that we do not have sufficient intellectual intellectual capacity, and the other capacities that Rambam talks about, which is the imaginative faculty, the perfected moral faculty, the correct emotional faculty. Okay? The reason we don't attain perfection is because perfection of that nature is not attainable by human, but it is attainable hypothetically by human intellect, but it's not attainable in the real world through human effort. We are limited. We are circumscribed in space by the very nature of physicality. We are circumscribed in intellectual capacity by a lack of complete information, or not getting complete education, or just a very slow process of mental maturation. It takes us time to come to the ability to understand certain concepts, and we need to learn certain concepts A, B, C before we can learn D, E, F, G, not to mention X, Y, Z.
Or as the sphere.
But that's a different concept. Okay. And we are limited in time by the fact that we all die. And all of these and other human limitations hinder our attaining perfect knowledge. The Torah was thus given us as a guide. God must act logically in a world whose objective is to bring humans to intellectual perfection. This is Rambam's fundamental view of how God interacts with us in the world. If God can at any moment fly off and do the impossible, then our intellect will never be sufficient to attain the understanding which is the very goal of human existence. In fact, if God can and routinely does do the impossible, then in Rambam's view, all of human existence kind of becomes a cheap carnival trick. It's like we're being made fun of. I believe that Rambam would definitely subscribe to Einstein's famous statement, God does not play dice with the universe. Right? What Einstein was saying was, you're telling me that everything works logically and it's all driven at its core by some illogical, incomprehensible process. He said, that doesn't make sense. And in Rambam's world, that's exactly what we're talking about. That everything in our world, up and down, from the four elements through the spheres to the nature of God, all makes sense in such a way that our intellect has the capacity to understand it. How far along that road towards comprehension we will go in our lifetimes depends on many factors, many of which are under our control and many of which are not. Sir?
I don't think the point is, and I actually think it's foolish to say that the finite could ever understand the infinite. I think the issue is, how does the finite respond to the impossibility of not understanding the infinite? I think that's our purpose.
Okay. I'm not arguing that you're wrong. I think there's a lot to what you say. It's not the core of Rambam's philosophy.
Okay.
The core of Rambam's philosophy is that we must strive to an intellectual perfection whereby we will our mind at its ultimate will merge with the intellect of God. It's to put it simplistically, it's a very Aristotelian way of looking at God as the ultimate intellect. As we've said before, Rambam's world is very largely kind of Aristotle's world, with a couple of, the number of things that are fundamentally different are small, but they're huge. Like God as the creator, that God creating the universe, not the universe existing forever, God being accessible to human beings, God caring about human beings. But in Rambam's world, and it's not inconsistent with the thinking that came before him, for example, Rav Sadia Gaon, that in Rambam's world, God's if you remember, we talked about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the Kuzari. And Yehuda Halevi at a certain point says, yeah, the intellect can understand things, but that's not our job. Our job is to believe. So it's kind of simplistically stated, the dichotomy is between, do I just believe and do what Chazal tell me and what the Torah tells me to do, or do I do what Chazal tell me to do and do what the Halacha tells me to do and learn the Torah, and all of that in the service of using the intellect that God gave me to in some way come close to and ultimately to merge with the ultimate divine intellect of God. Shvua Tov. Okay, I would also say, where are we now? Sorry. Yes, I would just say so that we have to understand that God's laws, as Einstein stated with respect to the laws of physics, Rambam I think also would state with regard to the laws of the way creation works, that our life often appears random, but it's not random. A guiding intellect resides at the core of this seemingly confused and random mess of creation. Shvua Tov, welcome. All creation is governed by God's immutable laws, and even though we will never understand them, we know that God's laws and God's intellect underlie all existence. Life is many things, but the Rambam assures us one thing it is not random.
So it's Ashkachat Pratit.
Ashkachat Pratit is also, we haven't spoken of that yet. That comes later in the principles. But yes, that's obviously a big departure from Aristotle, who believed that God was so perfect that God didn't even take notice of us. Right? So the second principle, I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, is unique. There is no uniqueness like Him in any manner, and that He alone is our God, who was and is and ever will be. I think it's safe to say that this notion of God's unity, God's absolute and unique oneness, is not really subject to challenge by Jewish thinkers. And I think, there are, Rambam pretty much rejects mystical notions, the whole menagerie of spirit beings, and then other notions that have become part of our, certainly mainstream rabbinic thought, that are discussed at great length in the Gemara, for example, notions such as the Shekhinah, the Shedim, the evil spirits, the angels, and Kabbalistic emanations, and so on. These are, in Rambam's world, I would suggest that this is like simplifying it a little bit, but these are tools, and we're going to talk about it again in just a second. These are tools that really get in the way of our understanding God, and they spill over into superstition. I think we have a serious issue with the third principle, which is that of God's non-corporeality. I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, is not corporeal, and that He is beyond all corporeal concepts, and that there is nothing at all comparable to Him.
I've never had a problem with that.
Sorry?
Whether I'm smart or stupid, but I've never had a problem with that.
I'm not saying that you're smart or stupid. I'm saying that the Rambam is making actually a somewhat radical statement for his time. Rambam's principle of non-corporeality is pretty much universally accepted today, to the extent that anyone who ventures to say that it might be otherwise is immediately pegged as being a heretic or ignorant. The fact,
accepted by Jews, not
yes,
by Christians.
yes, by Jews, exactly, in the Jewish world. Thank you. The fact that there are discussions in the Gemara which very clearly center around a corporeal manifestation of God. Right? We have the famous Gemara right at the beginning of Torah Shabbat Pei, the opening pages of Gemara Brachot. They talk about, what arm does God wrap His tefillin on? What does it say in the parshiot of His tefillin? We know what it says in the parshiot of ours. What does it say in the parshiot of God's? And to say nothing of the endless passages in Tanakh describing God in anthropomorphic terms, right? God says, I will go down and I will see, I will stretch out my hand holds a sword, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is now universally understood in mainstream Judaism to be metaphorical. But it was not always so. As we noted in previous sessions when we were learning Sefer Madeh, there were serious and today accepted as great rabbinic teachers, notably, I would say, in Rambam's time, notably in Christian Europe, in Provence, in France, and in Germany, in the world of Ashkenaz, who wrote and spoke and taught of God's physical form. We noted, if you remember, the objection of the Ravad to Rambam's statement that those who we read it in Hilkot Teshuvah, so just recently, Rambam's statement that those who maintain that God has a physical form are heretics and are barred from Olam Haba. Says Ravad, many greater and better men than he followed this opinion on the basis of their interpretation of the Bible. So this is not the place to go into the intricacies of Provençal and Ashkenazi versus Iberian rabbinic thought, but it's important to note Ravid's significance. Ravid himself is also significant in the development of Kabbalah, in which physical depictions of the divine play a very important role. And there's also a second issue surrounding Rambam's blunt rejection of corporeality, and I think it's a very important practical issue. It's a pedagogical issue. The rabbis shied away from telling people that it is incorrect, or much less forbidden, to think of God in physical, corporeal terms. The rabbis understand the human mind. We are not capable of conceptualizing something that we cannot visualize. I don't care how smart you are, and I don't care how many advanced degrees in physics you have and in philosophy. So the rabbis relied on descriptions of God as manifest in this world to encourage people to follow a life of Torah. Rabbis understood we're not capable of entering into a relationship with something that is not, in some manner, a thing. So to tell people they have to have faith, and particularly under the hardships and sufferings of exile, and then to insist that they have to have faith in something that they can't imagine, and then to tell them that if they do imagine it, they're heretics and they're barred from their faith, it's a bridge too far.
I got a question.
Please.
In Migdal that we say every morning,
Yigdal,
there was
yeah.
a line there about...
Ein lo demut haguf ve'ein
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly from this.
Was the Migdal written like in the Middle Ages?
Yigdal was, the Rambam wrote this sefer, in the 1100, in the thousands, right? Yigdal appears, as I understand it, the first time in around between the 1200 and 1300. So it's before in the 1500s, Jewish intellectuals and thinkers in Christian Europe started writing all of these dogmatic articles, if you will, and it was largely a response to the proliferation of Christian dogmatic writings. So they had to come up with no, your dogma is wrong, my dogma is right. Let me show you my dogma. And so the 13 principles really kind of became formally codified at that time. But the fact that Yigdal was probably composed at least 200 years before that shows that there was a popular acceptance of it. And I don't know the subject for multiple PhD theses, obviously. I don't know the whole process whereby these 13 principles became spread across Judaism. Although remember, I think the accurate description of how these came, of what Rambam does, is he didn't make these up. He read very carefully through the Mishnah in Perek Chelek, the one to which this is an introduction. And it's all about how people do not qualify for Olam Haba. All the different ways in which Jews can lose Olam Haba. Okay? And then also at a tagline, the ways in which non-Jews can lose Olam Haba, because non-Jews can also gain Olam Haba. And so, the Mishnah has been around for a long time. And don't know whether it was Rambam's own writings or whether he was part of a movement, but he was the one who wrote it down. But so to take these 13 principles and make them like a bedrock of the faith, I think there was a logic to it, and Yigdal emerges from that. So just say, yeah.
Are we going to deal at some point the counter arguments?
Which?
To Maimonides?
I mean, just kind of in passing. We can. Do you want to delve into them more?
I think it would be worthwhile to compare and contrast.
We can do that. Okay, great. Bezrat Hashem, I will. The next couple of sessions, I will strive to bring some more fleshed out counter arguments. I think the Ravid's counter argument, which we mentioned before, I think is a very important one, because of the person who wrote it, he is contra Rambam, certainly in that point, and at the same time he's considered he's one of the great rabbinic thinkers of his time. So throughout our history, various teachers have embodied God in myriad forms. They could not say that God has a body. I mean, that was already taken, right? But they did embody God in various forms. And Rambam, I think I'm on solid ground to say that these all fit within the category that Rambam, broadly speaking, rejects, even though he may say that some of these are necessary as tools to teach us and to help to bring us closer, which he says about the Torah itself, right? He says the Torah has to use metaphors. He quotes the Gemara saying the Torah speaks the language of human beings. The language of human beings is God gets up off of God's chair and goes down to earth and sees what's happening, and God gets angry, and God reaches out God's hand, and God makes the fire fall, and God makes the water split. And Rambam says that's great. And those are all metaphors, and we get caught up in the cinematic.
From his nostrils.
Yes,
Yeah.
we get caught up in the cinematic aspect of it. Say, wow, I can just imagine, Cecil B. DeMille, right, the splitting of the sea. But among the embodiments that the rabbis, the various rabbinic thinkers, have brought forth over the years, God is an embodiment of God in some form of immanence, of being present in this world, right? Rambam's God is transcendent, and we can strive to connect on the level of the intellect. But there are many forms, there are many teachings that embody God in some form of immanence. God is light. God is emanations. God is goodness. God is justice. God is love. And any immanentization of God, in other words, any bringing God as a presence into this world, engages our concept of physicality. And therefore, it's a restriction. And we can go to the extreme, like one of the most famous concepts of Kabbalah is tzimtzum. And that is the notion that God purposely chooses to restrict God's own self so that the world can come into being. Right? Rambam pushes back and says, no, God is purely transcendent. God is not to be imagined and not to be visualized, and especially not in any way to be described as having any form of restriction. God is to be served through performance of halakha, through development of intellectual and moral perfection. Intellectual perfection is by definition pure, which is abstract, which is to say, ultimately, human beings are not capable of it, but we have to try. That is to say, it's
familiar with the concept of tzimtzum?
I can't say for sure. I believe that became promulgated after his death. It may have been, There's also like questions about where different branches of Kabbalah, that there was kind of a French Ashkenaz form of Kabbalah, and then there was a separate form of Kabbalah that developed in Iberia and in the Muslim world. And it's not clear, at least not to me, and I think it's ultimately, it hasn't been decided by scholars, like which Kabbalah the Ramban embraced, for example. So God is to be served through intellectual perfection, which is by definition a pure, which is to say an abstract thing. That is to say, it is transcending. One more sentence. To any extent that our intellect is bound to notions of physicality, it has not yet attained perfection. To any extent that we require some notion of immanence or contact or physicality to relate to God, we have not yet achieved intellectual perfection. The complexity of the seemingly simple statement of this third principle finds its full expression of God's non-corporeality, finds its full expression in the Guide for the Perplexed, where Rambam will state that one who believes that God has a physical existence is worse than an idol worshiper. Sir?
The Torah speaks for images, and we know they are just examples, metaphors.
Well, that's already an assumption, but okay.
Well, according to him.
Yes, okay.
So why there is only one metaphor which is absolutely forbidden? The image. It's a metaphor.
Are you talking about in Seta Debrot, that we're not allowed to make an image, or are you talking about in Rambam's philosophy? All of these come under that category. Those are rocket alerts across the country.
It's for real, isn't it? Look what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Look what's going on.
Okay. We have. Let's do the next one or two of the fundamental principles of the Ikarim. Number 4, we are to believe that the One is absolutely eternal. No thing exists before him, as many scriptural verses prove. This 4th fundamental principle is taught in the biblical verse, a dwelling place is the eternal God. The 5th,
list?
a dwelling place is the eternal God.
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
Good question.
זה חומר. רגע, תנ"ך.
No, I just need the chumash. I misspoke. Thank you.
Because that would tend to denote physicality, no?
Right, which we need the guide to explain what he's talking about. What are we looking for? We are looking for 33, 27. Right, so we don't have. Okay. Oh, sorry. Sorry. A moment. Okay, we are, according to this, we are in Parshat. Right. We're in Parshat V'zot HaBaracha, at the very end of the book of Devarim, at the very end of the written Torah. I'll read the English translation. May the locks on your border towns be strong like iron and copper. Halavai. May the days of your old age be like the days of your youth. Yishurun, there is none like God. God who rides the heavens is at your assistance. God rides the heavens in his majesty. Here's what Rambam is quoting. The heavens are the abode for God, who precedes all. The mighty ones of the world are found only below. He expelled the enemy from before you and said, destroy. Israel will live safely, and it will be safe for each person to live alone as Yaakov, in a land of grain and wine, with skies that drip dew, as Yitzchak blessed them. Me'ona Elohei Kedem ומתחת זרוע העולם, ויגרש מפניך אויב, ואומר, השמד. God will drive out the enemy from before you and will call out, destroy. And so he's bringing this pasuk that teaches God's pre-existence. God precedes all things. The fifth fundamental principle. Only God, blessed be He, is rightfully worshipped, magnified, and obeyed. One must not pray to anything beneath him in existence, not to angels, not to stars, or planets, or elements, or anything composed of these. Now remember, this was written before Mishneh Torah, but you will recall, those of you who were here, that Rambam goes into this in great detail in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, talking about how people who started out with knowledge of God came to then the worship of stars and planets and so on. And anything that we interpose or that we ask to intercede for us between ourselves and God, that's Rambam's fundamental definition of Avodah Zarah, right? So when we said a moment ago that Rambam will tell us in the guide that anybody who believes God has a corporeal existence is worse than Avodah Zarah, because what he's saying is that the nature of Avodah Zarah in Rambam's world is, I know that there is one God up there, but that God is completely out of touch. But that God has created a hierarchy of his servants, like his retinue, his retainers, right? So I may not have the president's ear, but I know somebody who's best friends with the Secretary of State. So let me go and speak to my friend and let him speak to the Secretary of State, and maybe the message will get to the president, right? And similarly, Avodah Zarah in Rambam's definition is, you know what? God created the sun, as God's great messenger to oversee the day, I'm going to pray to the sun and maybe the message will get to God. Right? Says Rambam, anybody who worships Avodah Zarah understands the fundamental nature of God, but does not understand the nature of what God expects from us, and that's a huge problem, and that's fundamental to the Torah. He says a person who thinks that God has a physical being, that person's not redeemable, because you might say to somebody, the sun doesn't listen to you. You can talk to God directly. But to say to somebody, you don't understand what God's all about, and they say, no, what are you talking about? God has a body. In fact, God was killed, and then God came back to life. What are you talking about? Of course I understand what God's all about. So all of these, the angels and the stars and the planets and the elements and anything composed of the elements, all of them are natural processes without self-determination or free will. Only God is free and all-powerful. Hence, we must not worship those powers which can serve only as a means to bring us nearer to God. We must think only of Him, leaving to one side all else.
Our way of getting closer through tefillah, isn't it?
That's one of the ways. That's one of our key ways of doing it. Yes, but
So we don't need all of them.
well, but these people pray to the sun. They pray to the stars.
They
So-
pray to the corporal.
Sorry.
They pray to the
To
corporal.
the
So
corporate.
what-
Yeah. So
What is meant praying to the star or to the sun or to whatever? Because I think you said, or he said, that you pray to the sun, that the sun should intercede to God.
in Hilchot,
Is this what he said?
in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, he says that there was a time when people had direct knowledge of God, and then over time that kind of got lost, and then people came and either because they really believed it, and I think the process that Rambam is describing is that some people kind of fell into the trap of belief, and then people realized that it was a way to gain power. And they came and they said, you know what, I heard this, see that star? That star sent me a message last night. And it said, if you pray to me, I will go talk to God and make sure that you will have wealth, that you will have health, that you will live in safety. And so let me show you how to do it, and you'll follow me, and together we'll pray to that star, and God will accept the message that we send through the star. Okay? There are Sidurim.
So the star in this case is an intermediary.
Yes, exactly.
So what
Is
about
what?
Yitzchak praying for Rivka? Rivka asked him, pray for me.
No, she didn't. Rachel asks Yaakov to pray for her.
Yes.
Rivka does not ask.
She didn't ask.
No, but if you look, I mean, it's interesting because we had a whole discussion about this at the Shabbos table also, right? It says they got married. He was 40 years old, and then he prayed for her because she was barren, and then Esav and Yaakov were born when he was 60 years old. So clearly, it's like 20 years passed between the time they got married and the time the kids were born. Clearly, there was difficulty conceiving, right? And it's interesting too because what language does it use? Well, sorry to go off on another tangent here, but Vayater, Yitzchak, ויצחק בן 40 שנה, וקחתו את רבקה בת בתואל הארמי מפדן ארם, אחות לבן הארמי לא לאישה, ויעתר יצחק לאדוני לנוכח אשתו, כי אחרה היא, ויעתר לו אדוני ותהה רבקה אשתו.
But the Shunamit did yes ask to intercede with God, with the Navi.
She doesn't pray to the Navi. She says, do me a favor. You speak to God, speak on my behalf. That's different. It's different.
It's an intermediary.
No, not in the sense that Rambam's talking about. I want to just point this out for a second because what's described as Yitzchak's prayer, the verb that it uses is ve'atar, which literally means like he dug up with a shovel. Like he was heaping up prayer in behalf of his wife. And God allowed himself to be dug up, if you will, and she became pregnant. And what does Yitzhak do then later on? What does his whole successful career consist in? he digs up wells. And he digs and he digs and he digs. He's the guy with the shovel. He's the digger. And in fact, whole psychological portrait of him, because what happens, he's got a little bit of a shtickle complex about his relationship with his father, right?
Understand.
And all of the wells that Abraham dug are filled up with earth. And Yitzhak, he uncovers all of them. He digs them all out anew. And only after he's dug out all of the wells that Abraham dug, then he digs his own well, and water springs forth, and that's Rechavot, right? It's a whole psychological process, right? He's got these problems from his childhood, and he's got to solve all of his father's psychological problems before he can tackle his own. And he does it successfully. And it's a Musar Haskel for us. It's a tremendous lesson for us. But Rambam's definition of praying to an intermediary is not going to a holy person and saying, God listens to your prayers. No, it's not, because the Shunamit does not pray to the Navi. She says, you know what? Everybody knows you're a Navi. Do me a favor, right? No, it's completely different. I'm not saying that Rambam would say it's a good idea, okay? But it's completely different in that she says, no, there's one God up there. God doesn't listen to my prayers, or I need all the help I can get. The more By the way, it's also one second. Also, what Rambam says, explicitly in the Halacha, that when we pray by ourselves, God sometimes hears our prayers and sometimes not. And when we pray in a minyan, all our prayers are heard. Right? So it's teamwork. There's power in numbers, and the more people are praying together for the same thing, the more Chazal teach us. The more likely God is to hear. I don't know, did anybody ever hear when you were a kid? Do you ever read Dr. Seuss's book, Horton Hears a Who? Okay. We are here, right? It's like, so there's a fundamental difference because, again, in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, he's talking about people say, God is beyond reach. But God is not beyond the reach of the angels. And the angels are not beyond the reach of the sun. I'm going to pray to the sun. And the message will be transmitted. Completely different process. Does it mean that a person should say, my prayers aren't good enough? I think Rambam would say there's power in numbers. I think Rambam would definitely say that it's important to us to act as a community, at the very least as a minyan, because he says there's like a magic transition between 9 and 10 praying together. It's a fundamental transition. So. Sir? Yes? No? Okay.
Well, no, I
There's
think
a minimum number of people have to actually be praying.
6.
Especially in
6, yeah. And there's a halachic dispute over whether you can count a sleeping person to a minyan, as there's also a halachic dispute as to whether you can count a golem to a minyan.
If you're awake,
A golem?
if you're sleeping while you're awake.
Most of us, most of the time. Well, me anyway. I don't know about you. So,
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, when Yitzchak prayed for his wife, it was just him. He didn't have a minion, and he was answered.
Nachon. Yeah. Well, the concept of minyan didn't exist then. In fact,
There weren't 10 Jews.
Jews didn't exist then, right? So I'd like to end here for today because I thought that the pizza was on its way.
Yeah.
Amen, amen. But we can certainly discuss until the food is served.